Do you remember those cheap kitchen items? The ones that made do when money was tight? In the 1970s, budget tools and repurposed containers kept meals on the table and proved how far thrift and humor could stretch. But looking back, were they just survival or something we've lost? You could walk into nearly any refrigerator in a working-class home in the 1970s, open the door, and there it was, stacks of plastic butter tubs filled with leftovers. It was never just butter inside anymore. Mashed potatoes, stews, a bit of soup, or even yesterday's spaghetti. All of it lived inside a container that used to hold margarine. To poor families, it was the most sensible kind of recycling. You scrubbed it out, dried it, and gave it a second life. They never sealed perfectly, which meant more than one fridge carried the faint smell of onion or meatloaf long after the meal was gone. Kids would know the disappointment of grabbing what looked like butter for toast and finding last night's beans instead. Still, these tubs represented survival. They were an answer to expensive glass Tupperware that only better-off families could afford. To the poor, these humble containers stretched every penny in every meal. In a way, they told a story about making do with what you had, even when it was not glamorous. Do you ever wonder if the ingenuity we had then has quietly disappeared from our kitchens today? When the peanut butter was gone, the jar did not go in the trash. It went straight to the sink, got a good wash, and turned into a drinking glass. This was the unspoken rule in poor households across the 1970s, and it made perfect sense. Why buy glassware when food companies were already handing it to you for free? Many of these jars were made from thick glass, sturdy enough to last years. Families would line shelves with them, each one slightly different from the next, creating a mismatched set that became the standard for daily life. Kids drank their morning milk from those jars, fathers filled them with iced tea after long shifts, and mothers served up lemonade at family gatherings with them lined neatly on the counter. And if you grew up in that era, you can still remember the feel of that thick glass rim against your lips. These jars carried more than just liquid. They carried the quiet pride of a family refusing to waste anything. They were proof that you could stretch $1, even down to the container that held your food. And maybe that is why so many people smile when they think back to drinking from a peanut butter jar. It was simple, practical, and just a little bit resourceful. What does it say about us now that we throw away what our parents cherished? Every kitchen cabinet in a poor family's home had its share of mismatched mugs, most of them given away for free at gas stations. They came as part of promotions. Fill up your tank a few times, and you got a mug with the station's logo stamped on the side. For families who could not afford full matching sets of dishware, these mugs were treasures. Bold block letters, clunky handles, and cheesy slogans made them instantly recognizable. But they held coffee just fine, and that was all that mattered. Fathers drank black coffee from them before heading off to work. Mothers sipped instant coffee while keeping an eye on the stove, and kids often ended up using the same mugs for hot cocoa on cold winter nights. Over time, these mugs chipped, cracked, and faded, yet they stuck around. In a way, they became family artifacts. What made them special was how they reflected a moment in time. They were more than free mugs. They were proof of how resourcefulness turned marketing gimmicks into daily life tools. They were also a reminder that the poor could not always choose matching or perfect things. Instead, they created comfort and meaning out of whatever they had. Looking back, do you think those chipped mugs held more warmth than the designer sets people buy today? Pickle jars were everywhere, and once the pickles were gone, the jar itself lived on. Poor families in the 1970s rarely wasted glass of any kind, and pickle jars were among the most versatile items in the kitchen. They were wide, sturdy, and sealed tightly enough to keep just about anything safe. Soups and beans often ended up in them. Some people used them for dry storage, sugar, rice, or flour when other containers were not available. And in more than a few households, pickle jars ended up holding nails, screws, and bolts in drawers because there was no budget for fancy storage bins. The faint smell of vinegar often lingered, no matter how many times they were scrubbed. What those jars offered was reliability. They stretched the usefulness of what you had already paid for. They filled the gap between what you wanted and what you could actually afford. In poor kitchens, That kind of thinking was the difference between scraping by and having a little extra to lean on. Today, when so much packaging is designed to be thrown away, do you wonder if we lost the quiet genius of those pickle jars? If you grew up poor in the 1970s, chances are your kitchen drawer held a stack of dish rags that once had a very different life. They were old towels, worn thin, cut down to size, and put back to work. Nothing went to waste, especially not fabric. Frayed edges, faded colors, and stains told the story of their first life. When they were no longer good enough to dry a person, they were good enough to dry dishes. They were scrubbed against counters, soaked in dishwater, and wrung out until threads started to unravel. Poor families could not afford to buy new dishcloths every few months. When you visited a neighbor's home, you would see the same thing. Stacks of cut-up towels folded neatly in a drawer, waiting to be used. What might seem ragged or second-rate now was, back then, just part of life. Those dish rags were symbols of resilience, proof that families knew how to stretch the usefulness of every item. They held the memory of a different time, when resourcefulness was second nature. Does it surprise you that something as small as a rag could remind people of both hardship and pride? Few items had as many lives in a poor kitchen as the mason jar. Originally made for canning and preserving food, these glass jars became the all-purpose tool of the 1970s. If you did not have money for new containers, mason jars stepped in. They stored leftovers, held drinking water, and even doubled as makeshift vases when flowers came in from the garden. For families who still canned vegetables, fruits, or jams, they were the backbone of survival, lined up neatly on shelves, filled with food that would stretch through winter. Kids remember rows of brightly colored preserves glowing in dimly lit pantries, each jar a small promise that no one would go hungry. The jars were heavy, durable, and endlessly reusable. Lids might bend or wear out, but new ones were cheap compared to buying entire new sets of dishes or cups. And when families gathered for summer dinners, it was not unusual to see mason jars filled with iced tea lined up across the table, their glass sweating in the heat. Mason jars were not a fad back then. They were lifelines. They gave poor families control over food supplies and offered a kind of security money a loan could not buy. Even today, people use them in trendy ways, but for those who grew up poor in the 1970s, they were never about style. They were about survival. Do you think today's decorative mason jars would still carry the same respect if people knew how much they once meant? In the 1970s, if you were poor, canned goods were your lifeline. And to open them, you relied on the manual can opener, clunky, crank style, and never quite sharp enough. Every poor family had one, and every poor family cursed it at least once. The can opener was never glamorous, but it was essential. Canned beans, soup, tuna, fruit cocktail, and vegetables were often cheaper than fresh. Families stocked up on them because they lasted, they filled bellies, and they did not require a refrigerator to keep. But without that stubborn little opener, none of it mattered. Using one was a skill. You clamped the teeth onto the rim, turned the handle, and prayed it did not slip. Sometimes it worked smoothly, other times it bent the can, splattered liquid, or left sharp, jagged edges that sliced a careless hand. Still, it did the job. Every pantry, every drawer, and every kitchen counter had one within reach. For poor families, the can opener symbolized more than convenience. It represented a dependence on food that was cheap, preserved, and mass-produced. It was a tool that unlocked survival. Every click of the handle was a reminder of how life revolved around stretching a dollar and making meals out of whatever was available. Can you picture a kitchen of that era without hearing that familiar grinding sound? Before plastic trays took over, the aluminum ice cube tray was king. And if you were poor in the 1970s, your freezer had one, or several. They were dented, stubborn, and frustrating, but they were indispensable. The design was simple: a metal tray with dividers and a lever to release the cubes. In theory, you pulled the lever and neat little cubes popped out. In reality, it stuck more often than not. You pulled with all your strength, the tray bent, and finally, with a loud crack, cubes went flying across the counter. Families joked about it, but no one could deny the tray was better than going without ice altogether. Poor households clung to these trays long after plastic ones came along, partly because they already owned them, and partly because they lasted. The aluminum never wore out, even if it grew pitted and stained from years of use. On hot days, kids waited eagerly for their turn at a frosty cube, while adults added a few to tall glasses of tea or soda to make simple meals feel just a little more refreshing. The tray was not elegant, but it was part of daily life. It symbolized small comforts in homes where luxuries were rare, and maybe that is why, decades later, people still remember the sound of that lever snapping loose. Do you miss the stubborn charm of something so simple, yet so essential? If you grew up poor in the 1970s, chances are your kitchen table wore a vinyl tablecloth decorated with bright flowers. It was cheap, easy to wipe clean, and lasted just long enough before cracking and peeling. For families scraping by, that was good enough. The patterns were bold: daisies, roses, and sunflowers in colors that looked cheerful against otherwise modest kitchens. Mothers would drape them across tables before meals, smoothing out wrinkles while kids set out mismatched plates and utensils. They made the space feel dressed up, even if dinner was little more than beans or bread. Over time, the vinyl cracked, the edges curled, the colors faded, and eventually, a patch of tape would hold it together for a few more months. But still, families clung to them because they were practical. Spills wiped away in seconds, and worn tables looked presentable with one quick cover. For the poor, vinyl tablecloths were not about decoration. They were about dignity. They turned a scratched wooden table into a place fit for family meals and neighborhood company. They showed that even without money, a home could look cared for. Looking back, were those cracked tablecloths really just cheap plastic? Or did they mean more than we gave them credit for? Every poor kitchen in the 1970s had a set of enamel mixing bowls. Heavy, often chipped along the rim, they were the workhorses of daily cooking. Whether it was bread dough, cake batter, or mashed potatoes, those bowls carried the weight of family meals. They were not perfect. Chips exposed the dark metal underneath, and sometimes rust would creep in. But families kept using them anyway, because buying new ones was out of reach. The enamel was strong enough to survive being dropped, stirred, and scraped 1,000 times. Mothers mixed pancake batter in them before school mornings, fathers tossed salads in them on weekends, and kids licked the spoons clean while the bowls sat soaking in the sink. These bowls were passed down, inherited from mothers and grandmothers, each one with its own history of meals prepared and shared. They were part of birthdays, holidays, and everyday suppers that stretched cheap ingredients into something filling. Enamel bowls were never about luxury. They were about tradition, durability, and making do. In poor kitchens, they proved that even worn tools could create meals that brought families together. And maybe that is the point. Chipped enamel did not ruin the food, it only made the story richer. Do you still remember the sound of a metal spoon scraping across enamel, echoing through a crowded kitchen? Every poor family kitchen in the 1970s had a set of aluminum measuring cups rattling around in a drawer. They were light, dented, and often bent so far out of shape you had to guess which one was the half cup and which one was the full. More often than not, they were hand-me-downs from grandma, carrying the dents and scratches of decades of meals. These cups were not fancy. They had no polished finish, no decorative handles, and no perfectly printed measurements. But they got the job done. Mothers used them to measure out flour for biscuits, children used them to scoop sugar for Kool-Aid, and fathers pulled them out when helping with pancakes on Sunday mornings. They clanked loudly against mixing bowls, their sound unmistakable in a small kitchen where every tool was in constant use. Sometimes the numbers wore off completely, leaving families to rely on memory and instinct. You just knew which cup was which because you had used it so many times. Some families tied strings to them so they would not go missing. Others stacked them together like little nesting dolls of aluminum, always ready to serve. For the poor, these cups were not just utensils, they were continuity. They connected one generation of cooking to the next, bridging the gap between grandparents who survived the Great Depression and children learning to make simple meals in the 1970s. They represented meals stretched as far as they could go, and the humble pride of creating something from almost nothing. Can you still hear the hollow clink of aluminum against enamel echoing through the kitchens of yesterday? Store-bought pies were a treat in poor households, but the real treasure came after the pie was gone, the tin pan it came in. Those thin, shiny pans were never thrown away. They were washed, stacked, and reused until they were so warped you could barely recognize them. Mothers used them to bake again and again, even if the flimsy metal barely held its shape. Sometimes the pies came out lopsided, the crust burnt in one corner and pale in another, but no one cared. It was still dessert, and the pan had earned its place. Some families used them for casseroles, others for cornbread, and still others turned them into makeshift trays for serving snacks at birthday parties. The pans did more than bake. Children used them as toys, drums, frisbees, or even shields in backyard games. Fathers tucked them under car parts to catch dripping oil. And when aluminum foil was too expensive, people lined the old tins with wax paper and used them to freeze leftovers. These pans symbolized thrift. They showed how a single purchase could ripple through daily life far beyond what the company selling it ever imagined. To poor families, they were not disposable. They were part of survival. And though today we throw away pans without a second thought, those reused tins were proof of a generation that squeezed value out of everything. Do you think today's throwaway culture could ever truly understand that kind of resourcefulness? Step into a poor family's kitchen in the 1970s, and you might spot a set of wooden spoons hanging neatly on the wall. They were part decoration, part necessity, and fully affordable. You did not need fancy gadgets when a simple wooden spoon could stir soup, mix dough, or scrape the bottom of a pot without scratching it. The spoons came in sets, often gifted at weddings, handed down from relatives, or bought cheaply at discount stores. Hung proudly in little wooden racks, they gave the kitchen a homely touch. Mothers reached for them daily, their hands wrapping around handles darkened from years of oil, gravy, and stew. Children sometimes played with them, drumming on pots while dinner simmered. Over time, the spoons cracked, split, or took on the flavor of whatever they touched. Garlic, onion, and tomato left behind ghosts of meals long past. But families held on to them anyway. They could be sanded down, oiled, or simply ignored, because buying new ones was not always an option. The sight of those spoons hanging in plain view spoke volumes. They were not just tools. They were markers of family meals, of daily survival, and of quiet pride in keeping a home functional. The poor did not need polished silver or decorative utensils. A wall full of wooden spoons was both statement and solution. Do you remember the feeling of one in your hand, heavier with history than any brand new utensil could ever be? Before electric mixers became standard, poor families held onto their hand egg beaters, the old crank-style whisks that demanded patience and muscle. They looked simple, with metal blades that spun when you turned the handle. But they were the heart of countless meals in the 1970s. Mothers whipped eggs for scrambled breakfasts, children helped beat cake batter, and fathers sometimes stepped in to churn pancake mix until their arms ached. The rhythm of the crank made a distinctive sound, a kind of clattering hum that filled kitchens on Saturday mornings. There was no plug to break, no motor to burn out, just gears and elbow grease. Of course, they had their flaws. The gears often stuck, the blades bent out of shape, and cleaning them was always a chore. But poor families kept using them because the alternative, buying an electric mixer, was far too expensive. Besides, the beater worked well enough. With enough turns, you could froth eggs, whip cream, or mix batter to perfection. These egg beaters symbolized endurance. They stood as proof that hard work in the kitchen could replace costly gadgets. In the hands of the poor, they represented resourcefulness, persistence, and the determination to make good meals despite the lack of luxury. Today, they might seem like antiques, but do you remember how satisfying it felt when you finally saw those eggs turn fluffy under your own power? Gas stations in the 1970s gave away more than mugs. They handed out plastic water pitchers too. For poor families, these freebies became daily essentials. Brightly colored, often stamped with a logo, They found a permanent place on kitchen tables and in refrigerators. The pitchers were rarely elegant, but they poured iced tea, lemonade, and water every single day. They also traveled. Families took them to picnics, potlucks, and church gatherings, filled with sweet drinks that made meals feel more festive. They were not glamorous, but they symbolized practicality. The poor relied on giveaways and freebies to supplement their homes, stretching every dollar by turning advertising promotions into daily life staples. Looking back, do you think those pitchers carried more than just water? Maybe they carried the quiet dignity of a family making do with what they had. Every poor kitchen in the 1970s seemed to have one. A ceramic cookie jar shaped like a pig, a cat, or some other cheerful animal. They were kitschy, a little tacky, and rarely filled with actual cookies. More often, they held saltines, crackers, or whatever snack was cheapest. Children loved them. Mothers used them as a way to brighten the kitchen, a splash of charm in a room where money was tight. The jars chipped easily, their paint fading after years of use. Some families glued them back together when they broke, refusing to throw them away. To the poor, these jars were more than decorations. They were symbols of hope and playfulness. Even when cupboards were nearly empty, the cookie jar still stood proudly on the counter, suggesting abundance even when it was not there. Do you remember the sound of that lid clinking shut, promising more than it could ever actually hold? Long before modern dishwashers became common, every poor family kitchen had a wire dish rack by the sink. Usually coated in cheap white or green plastic, they rusted quickly, their coating peeling away. But they were used day after day without fail. After dinner, mothers stacked washed plates neatly in the rack, glasses upside down, utensils clattering into the side compartments. Children dried dish after dish with ragged towels, passing them to parents who tucked them into cupboards. They were not stylish, and they certainly did not last forever. Still, no one replaced them often. You used the same rack until it collapsed under its own weight, then maybe bought another cheap one at the corner store. For the poor, the dish rack was part of a nightly ritual. It represented teamwork, families gathering around the sink, washing, drying, and stacking dishes together. It was a moment of rhythm and routine, of order carved out of chaos. Looking back, do you think those rusted racks held more than dishes? Maybe they held the memory of family life in its simplest form. Before drip machines and single-serve pods, the percolator ruled the 1970s kitchen. If you were poor, you probably had one on the stove, sputtering and gurgling as it brewed. The smell of strong coffee drifting through the house was enough to start any morning, even before the first sip. The percolator was simple. Water bubbled up through a metal tube, spilling over coffee grounds again and again until the pot was rich and dark. Sometimes it was too strong, sometimes too bitter, but no one complained. It was coffee, and it kept people going. Children grew up with the sound of that bubbling pot as part of the soundtrack of daily life. And when guests came over, the percolator sat proudly on the table, proof that even the poorest homes had hospitality to share. The percolator was not just a tool, it was a ritual, a comfort, and a daily reminder of togetherness. Do you still remember that sound, steady and soothing, like the heartbeat of a 1970s kitchen? Before dishwashers, poor kitchens leaned on wooden drying racks. They unfolded clumsily in cramped spaces, holding wet towels that hung limp after endless cycles of washing, wiping, and scrubbing. Simple and collapsible, they became fixtures in kitchens where space and money were both scarce. The racks were made of thin slats of wood, often squeaky and uneven. Families unfolded them after supper, draping towels carefully across each rung. They wore down quickly, splintering with age and sagging under damp weight. But poor families did not replace them often. They patched, nailed, or tied them back together, stretching their life as long as possible. To the poor, these racks were not about convenience. They were about practicality. They stood as silent proof that survival often meant small, unglamorous tools doing big work. Do you think today's families, with machines doing all the washing and drying, will ever understand the patience built into those wooden slats? In many poor households of the 1970s, space was scarce. The solution? A cheap folding card table tucked against a wall, ready to be pulled out at a moment's notice. These wobbly little tables served as prep counters, dining tables, and sometimes even homework desks for children. The surfaces were thin, covered in fake wood grain or vinyl that peeled over time. The legs bent, the hinges squeaked, and they never sat perfectly flat. Still, they were invaluable. Mothers rolled dough on them, fathers cleaned fish on them, and kids ate their cereal at them when the main table was too crowded. They were also part of family gatherings. During holidays or birthdays, the card tables came out, lined with mismatched chairs, creating enough space for everyone to sit together. They groaned under the weight of casseroles, pies, and steaming pots, yet somehow always held steady enough. For the poor, the card table was a symbol of adaptability. It turned tiny kitchens into gathering spaces, offering flexibility when money and room were tight. It may have been cheap, flimsy, and temporary in design, but in practice it carried the weight of countless meals and memories. Do you remember the sound of those squeaky hinges opening up, ready to serve once again? For poor families in the 1970s, the stovetop pressure cooker was both a blessing and a source of dread. Affordable and efficient, it could take the cheapest cut of meat or the toughest beans and turn them tender in a fraction of the time. But when it hissed and rattled on the stove, children would cover their ears, convinced it might explode. These cookers saved money by stretching meals further. Mothers loaded them with vegetables, bones, or scraps, and within an hour, the kitchen filled with the smell of hearty stew. The little weight on top jiggled and hissed, announcing that dinner was on the way. But the noise also reminded families of how fragile the whole contraption felt. One wrong move and hot steam could blast across the room. Despite the fear, pressure cookers stayed in use because they made life manageable. They symbolized making the most out of what little you had. For the poor, that meant nourishing a family with the cheapest ingredients transformed by nothing more than pressure, patience, and courage. Do you still remember the sharp hiss that filled kitchens like a warning and a promise all at once? No poor kitchen in the 1970s felt complete without at least one cast iron skillet, usually passed down through the family. Blackened, heavy, and scarred from decades of use, these skillets were treated more like heirlooms than cookware. They fried eggs in the morning, browned potatoes at lunch, and baked cornbread at night. The flavor of a cast iron skillet was unmatched, seasoned by generations who cooked before you. Families could not afford to buy new pans often, but cast iron did not need replacing. It only needed care. A wipe with oil, a bit of scrubbing, and it was ready again. Children learned to respect them, struggling to lift their weight, but fascinated by their history. Every mark, every scratch told a story of meals that had stretched lean times. These skillets were more than tools. They were survival companions, carrying families through years when money was scarce. Do you think the meals tasted better because of the pan, or because of the history it carried? Even in homes where no one smoked, glass ashtrays sat on kitchen tables in the 1970s. They were cheap, easy to find, and always kept around for guests. The heavy glass, often with ridges for cigarettes, doubled as candy dishes, nut bowls, or even catch-alls for keys and coins. Smoking was so common that every household seemed expected to keep ashtrays. Poor families often collected them for free from diners, motels, or promotional giveaways. Some were plain, others carried logos from long-forgotten brands, but they all found a place in the kitchen. For children, the ashtrays were odd objects, sometimes filled with peanuts at Christmas, sometimes sitting empty, reflecting the light like little glass sculptures. They stood as quiet reminders of a culture where hospitality meant being ready for anyone, smoker or not. Do you remember how every table seemed incomplete without one sitting in the center, waiting for a use it might never see? By the 1970s, many families had moved away from baking everything from scratch, but in poor households, the flour sifter with a hand crank never disappeared. It rattled and squeaked, sending a fine dust of flour into the air as mothers or grandmothers prepared biscuits, bread, or cakes. The sifter was a relic of earlier times, yet it stayed because it still worked. Flour was cheaper in bulk, and baking stretched food further. A simple loaf of bread or a batch of biscuits could feed a family when money was scarce. The hand crank, though stubborn, reminded families of frugality and tradition. Often dented and rusting, these sifters still carried on, their mesh screens worn thin from years of use. They symbolized persistence, the determination to keep old practices alive when necessity demanded it. Do you still remember that soft cloud of flour hanging in the air, promising warmth and comfort in the oven? Salt and pepper shakers were rarely bought in poor households. They were collected, borrowed, or handed down, often plastic ones from diners. Simple, cheap, and usually stamped with logos, they became permanent fixtures on kitchen tables in the 1970s. They were never fancy. The tops cracked, the plastic yellowed, and sometimes the holes clogged with humidity. But they poured enough salt for beans, enough pepper for potatoes, and that was all a family needed. Guests never commented. Everyone understood that practicality mattered more than presentation. These little shakers, sitting in the center of chipped tables, were symbols of thrift. They were proof that nothing had to be wasted, not even a cheap giveaway from a diner. For poor families, they were everyday tools that quietly did their job, meal after meal, year after year. Do you remember twisting one in your hand, shaking out just enough flavor to make the simplest dinner taste like more? It is one of those things you barely notice until it slides into action: pocket doors. Unlike the typical swinging door, pocket doors vanish into the wall when opened, like a magic trick you can walk through. They were the height of clever home design in the mid-20th century, especially in homes that wanted a clean, modern look without bulky doors breaking up the space. You would find them separating dining rooms from kitchens or closing off formal living rooms when company arrived. Over time, though, they became a pain. The tracks jammed, the rollers squeaked, and once one went off its rail, good luck fixing it without tearing open the wall. Slowly, builders turned back to swing doors, and pocket doors became a quirky throwback. But if those walls could talk, they would whisper about family dinners, polite goodbyes, and the satisfaction of sliding a whole room out of sight. Now, speaking of questionable style choices, wait until we step into the softest, strangest room in the house: the bathroom. Orange and brown. Together, they were supposed to represent warmth, nature, and the grounded spirit of the 1970s. Designers called them earth tones. Homeowners called them modern. But within a few years, most people started calling them ugly. These colors crept into every corner of the house, from rust-colored curtains and burnt orange sofas to chocolate-brown carpets and gold-tinted kitchenware. When paired with low lighting and wood paneling, the effect was not soothing, it was stifling. Rooms felt smaller, homes felt older. The optimism of the post-war era was gone, and in its place came heavy, saturated tones that weighed everything down. It was like living inside a forever sunset that never let up. Even kids' bedrooms, meant to be bright and fun, often ended up looking like burnt orange caves. By the time the 1980s rolled around, decorators ran screaming toward pastels, neon, and glass. Orange and brown were buried under coats of white paint and forgotten, like the dusty shag carpets they often matched. But style was not the only thing people gave up on. Sometimes, even the furniture itself just gave out. The butter mold was once a quiet symbol of pride that lived in farmhouse kitchens and rural homes across the country. Before butter came in sticks wrapped in wax paper and stacked in supermarket coolers, it was made by hand, from cream churned for what felt like hours. But churning was only half the ritual. The real finish came when that butter, thick, golden, and soft, was pressed into a hand-carved wooden mold. These molds came in all shapes and designs: roses, wheat stalks, stars, initials. Some were simple, some were intricate, but all of them said the same thing: this was made with care. They were not just decorative, they were a mark of identity. In local markets and community fairs, families were recognized by their unique butter stamps. It was not branding, it was heritage, a kind of craftsmanship that was passed down like a recipe. Butter molds were rinsed, dried, and stored in the coolest cupboard. They were cleaned with a toothbrush, handled like treasure. Today, you will find them dusty on antique shelves, mistaken for cookie presses or quaint kitchen decor. But they were never just for show. They were the final touch to a process that took time, patience, and love. When did we stop honoring the beauty in what we used to make by hand? Before Bluetooth speakers and smart home assistants, there was the built-in wall radio. Usually installed near the phone nook or tucked into a panel above the kitchen counter, this was your portal to the world. With one turn of a giant knob, you could get the weather, farm reports, school closings, or your favorite midday jazz station. Some had small intercom buttons for calling upstairs or out to the garage. It was kitchen multitasking before anyone used the word. Moms would hum along while stirring soup or call the kids for dinner through the built-in speaker. You knew what time it was by the voice on the radio, not your phone. It was the soundtrack of daily life, soft static, local news, and old familiar jingles. Even the quiet moments felt fuller with it playing in the background. But as media moved to TV, then to handheld devices, these built-ins became obsolete. Wires were cut, faces painted over. Now, if you find one in an old house, it looks like a forgotten control panel from a spaceship. Once, it brought life into the kitchen. Now, it is just a silent square on the wall. We carry entire sound systems in our pockets today, but they do not echo down the hallway the same way. What did we lose when the kitchen stopped singing? There was something magical about the way the old telephone sat in its little nook. Not on a table, not hanging on a wall like we see in movies, but placed neatly in a purpose-built cubby carved right into the wall itself. These were telephone niches, and they were as common as house keys back in the day. You would see them in hallways, right outside the kitchen, or even tucked near the staircase, with a tiny shelf for the family phone book. Yes, an actual book. And maybe a little drawer for pens, paper, or the odd scribbled message. These spaces were like the beating heart of the house's social life. It is where gossip was whispered, news was broken, and the kids begged their parents to let them stay out late. Today, it is hard to imagine building a wall just for a phone, but back then, it was a sign of class and convenience. The sound of that rotary ring echoed through the whole house, and whoever answered it first? Well, that was usually the person who got stuck taking the message for everyone else. It is a slice of life that simply does not exist anymore, but it lived, loud and proud, in homes all across America. If you lived through the 1970s, you remember the feel of it between your toes. Shag carpeting was more than a design choice, it was a movement. Bold colors, thick fibers, and the kind of plush softness that made you want to lie down and never get up. From mustard yellows to burnt oranges, it blanketed floors in every room, including bathrooms, which is an idea no one has really been able to explain. Shag was fun and funky, but it was also a magnet for everything you never wanted in your house. Dust, dirt, pet hair, smells. And once it was in there, it stayed. Vacuuming was a chore. Deep cleaning was a nightmare. The very feature that made shag carpet so appealing, its thick, luxurious texture, was exactly what made it impossible to clean. People were not just pulling it up for new trends, they were trying to reclaim their air quality. What started as a symbol of comfort quickly became a maintenance disaster. Eventually, people tore it up in favor of cleaner, sleeker options. Shag rugs might have made a small comeback, but the wall-to-wall version? It is staying in the past, where it belongs. Of course, nothing trapped dust, or the mood of a dark, cramped house, quite like what was hanging on the walls. The electric egg poacher was the quiet champion of a better breakfast. Small, unassuming, and often overlooked, it sat tucked away in the corners of countertops, promising soft whites and warm yolks without a pot or pan in sight. You filled the base with water, cracked your eggs into the holders, and watched the steam rise slowly into a gentle cloud. It was perfect for those who wanted elegance without the effort. No vinegar, no swirling water, no chance of a ruined yolk. Just press the button and walk away. In a world full of toasters and coffee makers, it whispered, "Take your time." It belonged to the kind of home that played soft jazz on Sunday mornings and served breakfast on ceramic plates instead of paper towels. The poacher did not need to be flashy. It was consistent. It gave people back their mornings. And yet, it faded. Because poached eggs stopped being everyday meals. Because we forgot how nice it was to feel fancy before 9 in the morning. Now, most sit in thrift shops, unused and unappreciated. But for those who remember, one bite of that perfectly poached egg takes them straight back. When did we decide breakfast was no longer worth slowing down for? Tucked quietly beneath the sink, the under-sink water heater was one of those features you never thought about, until it saved you 5 minutes in the morning. These little tanks provided instant hot water to just one faucet. Perfect for hand washing, quick dishes, or shaving if your sink doubled as a grooming station. Unlike the giant water heater in the basement, this one was small, efficient, and practically invisible. In homes where the main water heater was far away, these under-sink units made life easier. No waiting for hot water to snake through the pipes. But over time, centralized systems improved. Builders started planning homes with better plumbing routes. Energy efficiency standards changed, and these tiny tanks were declared unnecessary. Today, most have been removed or sit unplugged, collecting dust in old houses. But their legacy lives on in those first few seconds of hot water we all take for granted. Once, someone thought of that. Once, someone made it easier. When did we stop building for the little moments? You would toss it in and forget about it. That was the beauty of the laundry chute. A small hatch built right into the hallway wall or bathroom cabinet, leading straight down into a hamper, or sometimes directly into the basement laundry room. Just open, drop, and go. These vertical passageways were like magic portals for dirty socks and sweaty gym clothes. No more lugging baskets down 2 flights. No more arguments about whose turn it was. You just lifted the flap and let gravity do the work. Kids treated them like secret tunnels. Parents treated them like a godsend. But like many good things, laundry chutes eventually went out of style. Safety concerns popped up, especially with young kids and pets. And then there was the fire risk, as an open shaft could let smoke and flames move between floors. Add in the rise of compact laundry machines on upper levels, and suddenly the chute became obsolete. But admit it, there is still something satisfying about the idea of chucking a shirt through the wall. And speaking of walls, wait until you hear about the windows that were not exactly windows. In the 1970s, having a built-in wet bar was a sign that you had made it. It meant you were a host, a social connector, someone who knew how to entertain with style. The mirrored backsplash, the chrome railing, the smoked glass shelves lined with liquor bottles. This was sophistication, suburban edition. But the reality rarely lived up to the fantasy. These bars were often shoved into corners of the basement, barely used except during holidays or awkward neighborhood gatherings. They collected dust, the plumbing rarely worked right, and the built-in mini fridges started leaking after a few years. Not to mention, America's relationship with alcohol shifted drastically in the decades that followed. The cocktail party scene began to fade. Suddenly, having a fully stocked alcohol station in your house felt less glamorous and more like a relic from your uncle's disco phase. What was meant to impress became an eyesore, especially when surrounded by orange carpeting and faux leather stools. So many of these bars were either ripped out entirely or turned into storage for board games and wrapping paper. But at least they were not a physical hazard. The next luxury home upgrade? That one came with a built-in trip and a bruised shin. The O'Keefe and Merritt Aristocrat range was not just a stove, it was a throne. Towering over every other appliance in the room, this 734-pound marvel was the ultimate status symbol in post-war kitchens. It did not whisper innovation, it shouted it. With twin ovens, broilers, warming drawers, and a built-in timer clock, it looked like something from a science fiction movie, only real. Housewives of the 1940s and 1950s dreamed of owning one. Advertisements called it the Cadillac of kitchen ranges, and they were not exaggerating. You could roast a turkey, bake a pie, broil steaks, and warm dinner rolls at the same time. It was massive, yes, but that size came with function. Wide enamel cooktops offered space for every pot and pan. The dials were thick, confident, and satisfying to turn. It felt like driving a classic car, slow, powerful, and designed to last forever. But time moves fast, kitchens shrank, stainless steel arrived, and the aristocrat, once a dream, became too heavy, too large, too old-fashioned. Most were discarded during remodels, sold for scrap or left in garages like relics from a forgotten empire. But ask anyone who grew up with one, and they will tell you that stove made cooking feel like a ceremony. When did we decide that smaller meant better? Warming drawers used to be the quiet hero of the kitchen, especially when dinner was not ready all at once. Tucked just below the oven, this thin, shallow drawer kept plates warm so that food would not go cold before it reached the table. You would set it to low, slide in your dishes, and when the roast came out, everything was ready to serve piping hot. This feature was a nod to formality. Meals meant something, and every detail mattered. Back then, no one wanted to pile roast beef onto a cold plate. But as life sped up and microwaves took over, warming drawers started disappearing. They took up space. They were easy to forget about. And soon, they felt like a relic of a more elegant time. Builders stopped including them in standard models, and even higher-end kitchens started to phase them out. Now, if you see one, it is usually mistaken for a storage drawer. But once, it meant warmth, literally and figuratively. It meant taking care, not just serving food. When did we stop setting the table like it was worth it? Bathroom incinerators were exactly what they sound like. Tiny metal boxes installed near the toilet, designed to burn trash right on the spot. Sounds efficient, right? Maybe. But also, just a little bit terrifying. These units were popular for a short time in the mid-20th century, mostly in homes that were obsessed with cutting-edge convenience. They were meant for tissues, cotton balls, wrappers, and small bits of waste, not, let us be clear, diapers or anything major. You would flip a switch, hear a low hum, and then wait while your trash slowly vanished into ash. It was like having a personal bonfire inside your bathroom. Some even came with a little chimney that vented outside. Of course, the smell was something. And safety? Let's just say it was a different time. These machines were prone to overheating, and if you put the wrong thing in, you might get more flames than you bargained for. Eventually, people realized that trash cans and weekly pickups were a whole lot safer. So the bathroom incinerator quietly disappeared, along with the era of lighting your garbage on fire next to your shampoo. But while the bathroom was heating up, the beauty routines of the day were getting pretty cool. And I mean that literally. Just wait until you see the hairdryers. Pea gravel patios looked charming in home improvement magazines. Rustic, effortless, a little slice of the French countryside dropped into a suburban backyard. But once they were installed, the reality quickly set in. These patios were nothing more than a layer of loose, sharp-edged stones that never stayed in place. Chairs sank into them, tables wobbled, and walking barefoot was out of the question unless you had calluses like leather. Every breeze sent pebbles scattering into the grass, and lawnmowers did not take kindly to rogue gravel. Kids hated playing on it, pets tracked it indoors, and any kind of sweeping or raking turned into a full-blown yard battle. Even worse, the so-called drainage benefits rarely worked out, leaving the area soggy in winter and scorched in summer. Within a year, most patios looked patchy and uneven, like a poorly maintained construction site rather than a space for relaxation. Homeowners tried tamping the gravel down, adding edging, even gluing it in place, but nothing made it better. It was a great idea in theory, undone by the simplest problem: gravel rolls and people fall. Still, even inside the house, that same mix of fashion and frustration kept showing up, especially in the form of a curtain that was not quite a wall and not quite anything useful at all. The Philco Predicta television looked like it belonged in a spaceship, not a living room. Its bold design, featuring a separate swivel screen perched atop a futuristic base, turned heads the moment it arrived in 1958. This was not just a television. This was the future. The Predicta came in a range of pastel colors, with names like Holiday and Pedestal. It was slim, sleek, and shockingly modern in a time when televisions still looked like wooden trunks. For the first time, you could turn the screen without moving the entire cabinet. It was clever, it was playful, it made you feel like tomorrow had already arrived. But the beauty came at a price. Technicians hated servicing it. Components wore out quickly. Still, families loved it. They gathered around it, cross-legged on shag rugs, watching black and white broadcasts with wide eyes. It made television magical. Not background noise, not distraction. Magic. But magic is fragile. And soon, newer sets with fewer quirks replaced it. The Predicta faded into memory, too strange for the mainstream, too delicate for time. Now it lives in vintage stores and collectors' basements, quietly glowing with nostalgia. How did the most visionary television of its era become a footnote in history? The electric hot plate built into the countertop was not meant to replace the stove. It was there for the in-between moments, the simmering, the reheating, the lonely cup of soup on a gray afternoon. It looked like a single stovetop coil embedded right into the counter, usually near the sink or beside the coffee station. You turned the knob and it glowed red. No pots stacked on burners, no full stove required. For single servings or quick boils, it was perfect. They became especially popular in the 1950s and 1960s during the height of the modern kitchen boom. They were sleek, functional, and felt futuristic. But they came with risks. Open coils got hot fast, stayed hot longer, and were sometimes forgotten. Over time, homeowners chose to have more counter space instead. The coils vanished, replaced with cutting boards and clean surfaces. But those hot plates once stood for independence, the idea that a small meal still mattered, that a house could be big, but one burner could still feel like home. What part of the kitchen did we lose when we made everything smooth? We need to talk about the elephant, or maybe the shag, in the room. Carpeted bathrooms. Yes, wall-to-wall carpeting in the bathroom. Someone, somewhere, decided that stepping out of the shower onto tile was just too cold. So instead, they gave us plush floors that soaked up everything. These bathroom carpets matched the walls, the sink, the curtains. You had mint green bathrooms with mint green rugs from tub to toilet, pink bathrooms with matching fuzzy toilet seat covers and floor mats. It was peak comfort meets catastrophe. Over time, those comfy carpets turned into breeding grounds for mold, mildew, and mystery smells. Still, you have to give it credit for ambition. For a few decades, the bathroom was not just a place to get clean, it was a fully furnished retreat. These days, waterproof vinyl and ceramic tiles have reclaimed their throne. But every now and then, you stumble upon an old house with a powder blue plush floor and wonder what it was like to live so fearlessly. Now, if that made you raise an eyebrow, wait until you hear about the toilet paper holders. That could sing. Harvest Gold was never meant to be subtle. It was loud, it was proud, and for one strange decade, it coated every surface of the American kitchen. Paired with avocado green or orange, it was not just a color, it was a statement. You would find it on fridges, ovens, mixers, even your mom's favorite Tupperware. Advertisements promised it would bring warmth and cheer. But step into a Harvest Gold kitchen today, and it feels less like nostalgia and more like stepping inside a mustard bottle. The brightness that once felt cheerful began to feel aggressive, like a room that never let you relax. It faded fast, stained easily, and always seemed to clash with whatever came after. Like avocado green, it was an attempt to blend nature and futurism, and it failed at both. Once natural light hit a Harvest Gold refrigerator, the whole room seemed to glow with the hue of old mustard. Families tried to modernize around it, but nothing could mute the glare. And when the 80s arrived with chrome and pastels, Harvest Gold became the aesthetic equivalent of showing up in bell-bottoms to a wedding. Still, at least it stayed in its own space. The next design trend went everywhere and reflected everything. Jell-O molds were not just recipes, they were performances. In the 1950s and 1960s, These shimmering towers of gelatin were the pride of dinner tables and potlucks alike. Suspended inside were slices of fruit, vegetables, nuts, and sometimes even meats, frozen in mid-dance by the wobble of lemon or lime gelatin. The molds themselves were often metal, shaped like flowers, domes, or decorative rings. Housewives practiced their releases with reverence, praying the mold would slide out cleanly with a satisfying thwack. The result? A glossy, surreal centerpiece. Guests gasped, children poked. Recipes were passed from neighbor to neighbor, each claiming their version was best. But these creations were not just about looks. Jell-O was cheap, shelf-stable, and forgiving. It let families stretch their ingredients during lean times. It made leftovers glamorous, and it brought a little joy to a time when people needed something bright and strange and wonderful. Eventually, tastes changed. Molds disappeared into cabinets. Jell-O became a snack cup. But for decades, it was art, it was pride, and it was love in a ring-shaped dish. When did we stop celebrating the food that made us smile before it ever touched our lips? A countertop garbage chute might sound like science fiction, but it was once the definition of practical design. Picture this: a hinged square in the middle of your kitchen counter that popped open to reveal a direct drop into the trash bin below. You could chop carrots, peel potatoes, and then sweep the scraps in one motion. No fiddling with a trash can lid, no extra step. Just a quick flick of the wrist, and it was gone. In mid-century kitchens, these were genius, especially when you were making big meals and needed all the counter space you could get. It made cleanup feel like part of the flow, not an afterthought. One swift motion and the mess was gone before it had time to become a problem. But eventually, people began to worry about smells, pests, and hygiene. Builders stopped including the feature, and home cooks grew wary of having an open hole in the counter, even if it had a lid. Most of them were sealed shut or removed entirely during remodels. Today, you will only find them in untouched kitchens from the 1940s or 1950s. They are almost always covered in laminate or chrome trim, like a forgotten piece of spaceship tech. What other clever shortcuts have we erased without even realizing it? Popcorn ceilings were everywhere, and you did not think twice about them until one started flaking into your cereal. Created as an easy solution for soundproofing and hiding imperfections, these textured ceilings were sprayed on like cheap whipped cream, giving homes a bumpy, cratered look that no one questioned until they started falling apart. Vacuuming the ceiling became an actual task in some households, and painting over them was a test of endurance and futility. But the real danger was deeper than dust. Many popcorn ceilings contained asbestos, a now-banned toxic material that can cause serious health issues. Once people found out, the ceiling went from being just ugly to outright terrifying. Suddenly, every flake falling from above felt like a silent threat you could not ignore. That meant removing them was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous and expensive. Families who had lived under them for years were suddenly advised to bring in professionals just to make their homes safe again. Something meant to be invisible became the most threatening part of the room. And the disasters did not stop there. Just take a look under your feet. The Teas Made was not just a novelty. It was a revolution in how mornings began. A combination alarm clock and tea maker, it became a fixture in British bedrooms and a curious but beloved import in mid-century American homes. Imagine waking to the gentle hiss of boiling water, the soft clink of porcelain, and the smell of fresh brewed tea wafting through the air before your feet ever touched the floor. The Teas Made delivered this magic through simple but elegant engineering. A timer triggered the kettle. A mechanical arm poured the boiling water into a waiting teacup. No fumbling in the kitchen, no slamming drawers, just warmth and calm. Some models even included a gentle nightlight, glowing softly on your bedside table like a companion. It turned mornings into rituals. But rituals are easy to break. Coffee took over. Digital clocks became the norm. And the quiet grace of the Teas Made was forgotten. Now it exists mostly in memories and dusty attics. But for those who used one, the association is immediate. Peace, intention, A morning that cared for you instead of demanded something from you. When did we trade thoughtful awakenings for jarring alarms and paper cups? We have walked through the kitchens of the 1970s together, so share the one item you remember most in the comments. Give this video a like if it stirred a memory, and subscribe to keep those stories alive with us.